start. Well, good afternoon, and welcome to our event co-sponsored by the Department of Economics and Women, Gender, and Sexuality program. I'm the chair of the Economics Department, Zdravka Todorova, and I have the pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Jana van der Meulen Rogers. We are happy to have her visiting our campus and thank her for her willingness to share her research with us, as well as I am grateful also to Dr. Barbara Hopkins from the Economics Department for inviting Dr. van der Meulen Rogers and for hosting her. Dr. van der Meulen Rogers is a professor of women's and gender studies at the Rutgers University, and she's an economist by training. She has her doctorate in economics from Harvard. And her research focuses on social justice, including gender equality, economic development policies in global context. She has published articles on the topics of international trade, gender wage gap, labor standards, occupational segregation, war and women's work, maternal employment, and child health, as well as on other global issues. Dr. van der Meulen Rogers has worked regularly as a consultant for the World Bank, the United Nations, and the Asian Development Bank. She has served as the president of the International Association for Feminist Economics. And if you want to learn more about this association and feminist economics, you are welcome to collect one brochure about the association. Also, at the table here, we have brochures about our various programs in economics, which incorporating social issues, as well as you can find on that table the QR code for the Passport to Success, which is a program from the Russell College of Business, and this event is part of that Passport for Success. You scan on your phone. If you don't have the app, you download the app, Passport to Success, and you get points and prizes. So today's event will be followed by a seminar tomorrow, and Dr. van der Meulen Rogers is going to talk about child health among China's rural-urban migrant households. This event tomorrow will be at 2:30 in Wright Hall, room 248. Today's talk is on micro and macro data evidencing the economic benefits of LGBT inclusive policies. And please join me in welcoming Dr. Jana van der Meulen Rogers.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And again, also thanks to Barbara for inviting me here. And it's really a pleasure to see such a great audience. I left for a moment to go get a drink, and there was no one here. And I came back, and all of you were here. It's wonderful, because I know how busy you are. I teach at Rutgers, where it's hard to get students to attend events like this. So I'm just delighted to see your interest in this topic. So this paper that I am presenting to you today is co-authored with two people, one of whom, Lee Badgett, is another feminist economist who's really well known for her work on discrimination in the labor market against LGBT individuals. And she's done a lot of advocacy on Capitol Hill, advocating for more legal rights for LGBT people, and especially for passing legislation in the US that prohibits employers from discriminating against people based on their sexual orientation and gender identity. We still don't have federal regulation on that, and Lee Badgett has been a very active advocate for passing this legislation. And our other co-author, Kees Waldijk, a Dutch lawyer, has done excellent work quantifying legal rights on LGBT inclusion so that you can do something like what we're doing in the study in a more quantitative kind of way, and that's one of the first studies to do that. So it's really been a pleasure to work with both Lee Badgett and Kees on this study. And I'm happy to take any questions during the talk. This is a paper that's a work in progress. We are trying to get it published in a journal. It's under review right now at a journal called World Development. So we'll see how we do. So we're still revising. Hopefully we'll have the opportunity to revise for this particular journal. We'll see. So any comments are welcome. Okay, so what we're doing in this paper is asking if countries that are more inclusive of LGBT people, does it benefit them in a macroeconomic kind of way? Are they more successful economically? Or countries that exclude LGBT individuals, do they have some sort of economic disadvantage, or is there a cost of homophobia? So what we're doing is taking a conversation about LGBT people, which is often done in a human rights context, and we're having that conversation now in an economics conference, using the language of mainstream neoclassical economists, and in a way trying to get the attention of policymakers who sometimes want the numbers, in order to demonstrate some sort of evidence that the policy is needed. So this is an effort really to try to crunch some numbers as to, well, what is the benefit of having more inclusive policy? Okay, so again, we're trying to move this human rights discussion into an economic framework, and specifically a macroeconomic framework. And we are trying to link up what is quite a large literature on discrimination and stigma against LGBT individuals, and link that up with some evidence of the macroeconomic consequences of this kind of discrimination. Okay, so what the quantitative part of the study does, we have two sides of this study, is look at the link between inclusion of LGBT individuals and economic development using data for 132 countries. And we are actually testing a theoretical prediction, and I'll go into this theory a little bit, that when LGBT individuals are more included in social structures and political systems, in the economy, in the labor market, that will ultimately lead to a stronger economy. And there are two approaches in our study. The first is more a micro approach, where we do an extensive review of the literature, looking at what are the barriers to freedom for LGBT individuals to live the kind of lives that they ought to and want to be living. And how do these barriers potentially affect economic growth? Okay, and at the macro level, we are doing this statistical analysis of this association between LGBT rights and economic income per capita. Right, this is a contribution to the literature. Very few studies have done this, especially on the quantitative side, largely because there's virtually no data that looks at LGBT people on a larger scale and measures things like, their quality of living, their lived experiences, their income, their health, other measures of status. It's just not there. If you want to compare different groups of people, you need, in a quantitative kind of way, you need the data. It's just not there. So what we've seen so far related to what we're doing is two studies. One we did early on in 2014. It was a report for USAID using a smaller data set, a number of transition countries, high growth countries, 39 of them. And we found that LGBT rights are positively associated with with macroeconomic indicators, specifically GDP per capita. There was a published study by Berggren and Ellender, And what they did was use this large data set that's out there, the World Values Survey, in which many people across, it's available online, any of you could look at it. It's a big survey about people's attitudes towards things, attitudes towards politics, towards social measures. It's quite an interesting data set. And two of the questions on there, on this big survey, had to do with what would you think about having these kinds of people as your neighbors? And one was about having homosexual people as your neighbor, and that's the word that was used. And then another question was having somebody of a different race. And these authors used those two questions to measure tolerance and intolerance. And they actually found a negative association between tolerance towards LGBT individuals and economic growth, whereas they found a positive association when it came to race, tolerance towards race. We dug into their study quite a bit, as you can imagine, because they're finding pretty much the opposite of what we did. And we had a number of critiques I can go into later. But the bottom line is those are pretty much the two existing studies that do any kind of quantitative work around LGBT tolerance or inclusion. So on the micro level side, what we did was take over 200 previous studies looking at barriers to freedom that LGBT individuals experience. All kinds of barriers in the way of discrimination and violence in particular. And these various studies came from nonprofits, they came from multilateral agencies, different book chapters. The United Nations had a bunch of reports. Human rights groups like Human Rights Watch especially did a number of country studies documenting the treatment of individuals if they identified as gay, for example. And we looked at different measures of discriminatory treatment in these studies towards people who identified as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Okay, and what we found was very much, a systematic violation of human rights in these studies. And a number of these violations, if you add them up, across the economy, one could reasonably argue that they are likely to have a negative impact on economic development. And some of the outcomes that were reported in interviews, in participant observation, in documenting people's stories was less labor time at work, largely through absenteeism, lost productivity at work, people not investing as much in their education, in their training, or in other ways that would improve their human capital. An inefficient allocation of human resources. That's a lot of economics jargon. People not working up to their full potential or not being put into the jobs best suited for them because of discrimination in the labor market or even discrimination in schools. That people are not being channeled into the kinds of jobs that they could do most efficiently. And we argue that these kinds of outcomes, if you add them all up, at a minimum, you can say it cannot be good for an economy, but we go further to say that it's actually a drag on economic output at the macro level when you add it all up. It makes intuitive sense. So that's what we wanted to do in the study, was to take something that makes intuitive sense and see if we can support that with actual data. So here's just a kind of a little bit more of an illustration of what I was saying in terms of the types of social exclusion. What are the outcomes at the individual level? And when you add up all these outcomes across individuals, how might that affect the greater economy? Okay, so some of the evidence that we found in these 200 plus studies included evidence of violence experienced in schools, in prisons, police brutality, violence on the streets. Discriminatory treatment in prisons, job loss, discrimination in the labor market is a big one, and that's not just in other countries. This is going on in the US too, quite a lot of it. Rejection by families, another big problem, again, not just in other countries, big problem in the US, especially for transgender young people. Harassment in schools, and pressure to marry in heterosexual marriages, pressure from families and from society at large. What are some of the outcomes then at the individual level? People who are experiencing this kind of harassment or treatment may drop out of school or not advance as much in school as they otherwise would. They may be experiencing a lot of stress, anxiety, emotional issues, and that could lead to less productivity on the job. They may be earning less because of discriminatory treatment, and that can contribute to higher rates of poverty for people who are LGBT compared to those who are not. Some poor health outcomes, possibly shorter lifespans because of the issues around stress, and finally, lower labor force participation. Okay? And you add up all these different costs. At the macro level, we argue the outcome is lower economic output. Okay, Lee's done a couple of studies too, looking at these kind of costs at the business level and making the business case for LGBT inclusiveness, and has found evidence, as have others, that when you look at individual businesses or business measures, companies that are more inclusive in their company policies of LGBT people have better stock market performances, they have a more diverse workforce and higher measures of productivity at the workplace. So this kind of argument that I'm making for the macroeconomy, you could also make for a business case, looking at data at the firm level, and those kind of studies have been published, several of them. Okay. Let me add all the arrows in here. All right, LGBT inclusion and economic development. Why should they be linked? Okay, there's not just one simple theory, nor is there one causal direction. Okay, and here I'm going to just summarize briefly 4 different ways you can think about the links between these 2 indicators. And the direction in which the links may flow. Okay, and it doesn't have to be just one theory or the other. They could all be happening kind of at the same time. But these are 4 ways of thinking about why should there be a link? Why should the macroeconomy depend on LGBT inclusiveness? Okay, one theory, and that has the rate of causality going from LGBT inclusion to economic development, is the theory around human capital investment and investing in one's economic potential. Again, that's very mainstream neoclassical economics, where people invest in their human capital, and human capital is a major input into economic growth, and the more productive workers are, that's the faster the economy will grow. Okay, the other closely related kind of theoretical framework is the achievement of one's capabilities, and this links to an economist and philosopher some of you may have learned about in your classes, Amartya Sen, and some of his work around freedoms and the freedoms to be and choose and do what we choose to do. And once people have these freedoms, they are able to achieve what they are fully capable of doing, and that will contribute overall to the greater economy as a whole. And both of those directions of causality are from LGBT inclusion to economic development. You could easily argue that the causation goes in the other direction, and that would be this post-materialist demand for human rights. As countries grow richer, people demand more rights for themselves and their neighbors. Okay, and we want to see that the benefits of a thriving economy are shared by all. So people will lobby for improvements in their own rights and those they care about. So you could easily argue that a country is more inclusive as it grows because people, as they're richer, demand more for themselves, and they have the resources to fight for better human rights, whether it be for women, by race, or sexual orientation and gender identity. Finally, strategic modernization, that causality kind of goes in both directions. An intuitive way to think about this is that as countries modernize, they want to attract more resources, let's say from tourism or from foreign investments. And in order to do so, they need to be seen as attractive places to invest in, to visit. So they will strategically try to modernize by giving different groups rights, so to speak, having a more inclusive environment, investing in their economy so that as a country is thriving socially and economically, it will continue to attract more and more resources. And that is the strategic modernization way of thinking. So the bottom line is there's different ways to think about the causal channels and how they operate. And also the causality could go either way. And we are not proving causality in our study, just an association. All right, so I will go into really intuitively the quantitative part of the study and just give you an overall sense of what we did. So we are using statistical methods to look at the relationship between LGBT inclusion and economic development. And again, I mentioned there's not any data out there on LGBT inclusion. You can Google it and you won't find anything. It's just not there. So we had to construct our own indicator, and instead of looking at attitudes or openness, what we found we could quantify was legal rights. And this is mostly our co-author's work, Case. And I know I prefer the term same-sex over homosexual, but he named his index. It's his index. We'll call it the Gilrow for short. But the name of the index that Case developed, and I'll talk more about this in the next couple of slides, is the Global Index on Legal Recognition of Homosexual Orientation. It's a mouthful, so from now on I'm going to call it the Gilrow. And you can think of Gilrow as this quantitative legal index. And we link that with a measure of economic development, which we are using real income per capita, real GDP per capita. Okay, and we're using a readily available data set out there. Any of you could download it from where you're sitting on a laptop if you wanted to, the Penn World tables that many macroeconomists over the years have used to look at the determinants of economic growth. And we are using this data for 132 countries from the years 1966 to 2011. Okay, so again, this Gilrow. For the Gilrow, we looked at 8 kinds of legal rights. And we looked at every country in the world since the early 1960s. I believe it started for some countries actually in 1960, but no later than 1966. And if a country had a particular right, it got a score of 1. If parts of the country had the right and other parts didn't, they got a 0.5. And if they did not have the right, they got a 0. And we did this for 8 kinds of laws. And then we just added it up. So countries that did not have a single law protecting LGBT individuals, or if they actually discriminated against LGBT individuals, they got a 0. Okay, and a country that completely protected or was completely inclusive of LGBT individuals, they would get a perfect 8. Okay, and these 8 kinds of laws related to 3 different categories. The first category is the being allowed to engage in same-sex acts, that it's not criminalized. The second category is non-discrimination in the economy. And the third category of laws have to do with family rights, adoption of children, and legal recognition of same-sex relationships or being allowed to marry. Okay, and again, this was going back to the 1960s. So here are the exact 8 types of laws that we looked at for every country in the world, going back to the 60s, if they had this law or if they didn't. Okay, and the first law is if same-sex acts is legal between adults, and if the age limit is the same for same-sex acts and heterosexual acts. Okay, the second category, there are 2 laws related to non-discrimination in the economy. First, non-discrimination by sexual orientation, that's SO, in employment, and the other kind of discrimination based on sexual orientation is in goods and services. Okay, and you may be thinking, in the U.S., do we have this or not? You know, the U.S., again, is not a perfect case, and a lot of this is coming up again in this new administration. And the last 4 laws relate to the areas of families. So if there's any kind of legal recognition of same-sex couples who are not registered but living together, are same-sex couples allowed to register in some legal way? Are they allowed to adopt children? And finally, can they marry? Okay, so those were the 8 rights that we looked at. And again, countries could range from a 0 to an 8. There's no country in the world that has a perfect 8. We looked at the average across all countries. Blue is every country in our sample in the world, and red is the OECD. OECD, the nickname is the Rich Country Club. It's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, usually the rich countries of the world, so they are better off economies. And you look at the average Gilrow over time, and up until 1989, it didn't really change very much. So countries were not becoming progressive, really, in terms of their inclusiveness of LGBT individuals until starting roughly in 1990. And by 2011, the average Gilrow for all countries in the world was 2 out of 8, which is still not very good. Among all richer countries, it's a bit more optimistic, I think, more indicative of progress, 5.6 out of 8. Okay. So we did our statistical analysis. For those of you who have had statistics or econometrics, we did use regression analysis, where we look at the effects of different variables on GDP per capita. So we are controlling for other things, not just looking at the effect of LGBT inclusiveness. So the other things that we controlled for were things like investment, education, population. And once we control for that, we found that when a country had 1 additional right, so if the Gilrow goes from, say, a 3 to a 4, or from a 5 to a 6, on average, among all countries in the world, their GDP per capita will go up by about $2,000. Okay, and this effect is statistically significant, which intuitively means that it's not due to chance. Okay, so there is a positive association between LGBT inclusiveness and GDP per capita, And that effect is about $2,000 by adding one additional law, let's say banning discrimination based on sexual orientation in the labor market. If a country does that, its GDP on average will go up by $2,000. Okay, and again, in our analysis, we are controlling for other things that may affect the level of GDP per capita, including population, employment, the capital stock, international trade, and education. Okay, so what I gave you was the overall average. We did some other work that broke up this world sample into different regions, and we found that this effect was strong in terms of statistical significance in Europe and Central Asia, in East Asia and the Pacific, and the European Union. Okay, these are not mutually exclusive. We tried different breakdowns of different regions. All right. We also tried some other tests. We looked at, there's different ways you can look at this GDP data and these other control variables. There's other data, the World Bank has a data set you could use. And we tried adding other control variables. Our main results stayed the same. We also tried dividing this guild row into the three components: only family law, only non-discrimination, only non-criminalization. And we found similar results. If anything, they were slightly bigger in magnitude, but still statistically significant. Okay. Another question was, well, maybe countries that are more inclusive of LGBT individuals, that's capturing a gender effect, that this is simply the effect of the women's movement or women's rights or gender equality. So we tried adding in a measure of gender equality, and specifically the percent female in parliament or in the main body of governorship. How many people amongst the government leaders are female. That data was available for a smaller period of time, so the sample size went down, but we still got the same result. The magnitude was a little smaller, but still a positive effect of the gill row on GDP per capita. Okay. So in conclusion then, at the micro level, we found, especially in the human rights reports, widespread documentation that individuals who identify as LGBT are facing a number of barriers to their various freedoms in life, outright discrimination or even violence. And you add these up, could easily hinder economic development. Okay, and at the macro level, our statistical analysis showed that more legal rights for LGBT people are associated with higher per capita GDP. Okay, so what we argue is important to do is, of course, pass more policies that are inclusive of LGBT individuals, that will help economic development. We also need more research on this. There's not enough people doing this kind of research, which means we need better data as well. More training, more research dissemination, more lobbying. Okay, the word has to get out there, and I think the word needs support by more researchers doing this kind of work. In the future, what we're going to be doing, I think especially for this study, I have a feeling that the reviewers of our paper, if we get another chance, are going to want to see more evidence of causality. I think that will be something we have to do. Question?
Are you guys going to look at the differences between administrations, and is that going to be part of your causality, looking at how the administrations affect the economics versus
because you mean in the U.S.?
Or and elsewhere. Yeah. Okay. I think what we could do there in this Penn World Tables data set that I mentioned, there are some political variables that have to do with, I think, the degree of democracy, I think, is one. There's a couple of freedom measures. We could try adding those. I think earlier on we did a little bit of that, and our results were pretty consistent. But again, if our reviewers of the paper want to see more of these control variables looking at things like democracy, then we can easily add that in. The data's there. That's a great suggestion. I think additional papers would be interesting to look at tourism and investment. And does tourism respond? You know, if a country is known to be super inclusive or super exclusive, does that affect tourist flows? And we looked at levels of GDP. It might be interesting to look at growth rates as well. Now, I've been using the term LGBT not quite accurately because our data technically just looked at lesbian, gay, and bisexual legislation. There was not much information available on transgender rights. So technically, the analysis was looking at LGB rights. We did in our earlier report for transition countries, and this is where I'm going to leave you because I think it's an area for future research, look at transgender rights, but that was data captured by a different organization. And technically, let me see, the name of this organization was the Transgender Europe's Trans Respect versus Transphobia Worldwide. Okay, and they published this report looking at transgender rights in 1 year. It was in the year 2011 for 58 countries. So we were not able to include transgender rights because it was a much smaller group of countries. It was just 1 year of data. But I wanted to give you a sense of what could be done. So this particular organization looked at data on transgender rights across 16 different measures. And I won't read them all, but I'll read the 5 different umbrella categories. They looked at legal recognition, so things like people being able to change their name or their gender, legal protection. Is there actual discrimination written into the law? And in some countries there is. Do people legally have access to hormones, and do they have access to gender-related surgery? So in our earlier report, we just did a simple correlation analysis, no regressions, and we did find that in this 1 year of data, that countries that are more inclusive of transgender individuals do have higher GDP per capita. So there is a positive correlation. Again, we can't argue causality, but I do think this is interesting research for those of you so inclined. If you're into looking at laws and combing through different legal documents, I mean, this is new research that needs to be done. You could kind of go back in time and try to quantify this index with transgender rights and see how it relates to growth over time. And that is my last slide. Barbara.
It seems weird to me that Russia
Yes.
is like almost on the right.
Yes.
I mean, it's like it's trumped by Ecuador, India, maybe Brazil. No.
Yeah,
but
it's crazy. On the books, Russia looks good, but in practice, it's terrible to be in Russia.
There might be a gap between the legal structure and the actual practice.
Exactly. Yes, on the books, according to this organization, Russia does pretty well with what they have on paper when it comes to transgender rights. Many people would disagree. Yeah, I agree. Mm-hmm. So that's all I have formally, but I would love your comments, questions, your own perspectives. Yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering if you said like same sex a lot, and I was just wondering if you put any differentiation between like sexuality versus like romantic identities.
This was looking just at the legal rights, so no, there was no differentiation there, and I think I ended up reverting mostly to the term LGBT because it rolls off the tongue quicker. But the legal work that we did, mostly case, was looking at terms associated with lesbian, gay, same-sex, or bisexual. I don't think he looked more specifically at, can you repeat, you said on romantic relationships versus?
Romantic identity versus like sexual identities.
No, I think he looked more at sexual orientation and how it's legally phrased, and typically that would not go into on the romantic side at all. So it's very much, dry legal language in national documents. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So it's my understanding that LGBT are primarily Western labels. So how did you handle other countries and other cultures where they may have had like a different system of labeling or categorizing people?
I'm pretty sure that when Case did this work, he tried to come up with as many kinds of, because a lot of it was, he's not literally reading all of this legislation. I think he was searching using search engines. He'd get big legal documents and he would search on different keywords. So I believe him being, Dutch and global already was sensitive to how some cultures might use different terms. So I think he tried to use as many possibilities in his search engines and the keywords as possible. Mm-hmm. I'm Dutch too, so that's why, the plug for being globally aware and culturally sensitive, I think the Dutch are kind of known for that, to put in a plug for my own background in cases, yeah. Other questions or comments?
So you spoke about difficulties in finding data, and we know that a lot of data is influenced by states and administration decision to cut or not to cut certain agency for collecting data.
Yeah.
In an effort to collect more data to answer those diverse questions, what is your hope for, and what is a route for influencing data collection from the point of researchers?
Okay, I mean globally or in the U.S.? Globally. I think we have a lot of data collection infrastructure in place already. It's just a matter of adding some more questions to existing surveys. It's probably on the margin, and thinking like an economist, the best way to go in terms of collecting useful information. But it's just that it wasn't thought about until groups like, feminist economists started saying we need more questions about this kind of work, or about who owns assets, by name and not just a household. So I think before, putting in a plug for our association of feminist economists, it was often thought of, well, if you ask the household head all this information, then you get information about the household, and that should represent everybody in the household. But enough information, research came out saying that no, the distribution within the household is not equitable, and we need to ask specifically about men in the household and women in the household, girls and boys. So these are changes, I think, to existing surveys that have been done, that we get more information. But yes, it costs more to start a whole new surveys, like the time use surveys. The U.S. was one of the last countries to start a whole new survey about how people spend their time. It's been invaluable in research about gender, and many other countries were doing this before the U.S., but it does take more resources to start a whole new survey. But what I would like to see, at least as a starting point, is more disaggregated data in existing surveys with questions about gender as well as LGBT. So, questions about discrimination and so forth, or just identification. How do you identify yourself as? Not just male or female. That's typical. So it's just adding a few questions on existing surveys, especially household surveys that are already well used and the infrastructure is well in place. Yes.
At one of your earlier slides, you said that the data, that there was some research that also looked at how people were asked questions about race and sexual identity. Is that something that you've considered, especially looking at some of the intersectionalities between race and sexual identity, and if that matters at all. I mean, I can think of various questions, like you can ask in terms of race and sexual identity, but within the scope of this particular paper.
We did not look at any issues around intersectionality. I mean, I can only guess that it would be even worse for people who are both of minority status in terms of race and ethnicity, as well as identifying as LGBT. But we did not look explicitly at that. But that would be a hugely important area of future research, I agree. And to see, exactly just how much more of a penalty, so to speak, is there. But again, because of such limited data, even Lee Badgett's work, and she's probably the foremost expert looking at discrimination in the US against LGBT individuals, I don't think she's done much on the intersectionality either. And correct me, Lee's work. Yeah, it's largely because the data is just not there. It's a great question.
I noticed that one of your implications was that this is an issue of development, right? For your professional development. But then I noticed when you looked at the different regions where the association held, much of the developing world was not included in those regions. Can you talk a little bit more about how these associations played out in like sub-Saharan Africa or some of the other?
Yeah, that's a fair question. In terms of the developing world, where our result held up and was statistically significant was East Asia and the Pacific. And the other developing regions, and we looked at them all, we got positive coefficients on our Gilrow. So the association was in the same direction that we expected, but the result was not statistically significant, which means that if there is a positive association between inclusion and the level of GDP per capita, it could be due to chance. So we were not getting these estimates with economic precision, with statistical precision. But they are all in roughly the same ballpark of the magnitude, just not precisely estimated. Yeah, which is again a fair question. One would hope that you could argue more strongly that in developing countries that it matters, but what we seem to be getting, it's mostly being driven by Europe and the more richer economies in Europe. Other questions or comments? Or did anyone have anything to add? There were some really good questions. Other answers that came to mind, maybe I didn't answer a question in an entirely satisfactory way. No? Okay. Thank you.
And just to remind you, if you want a brochure about our next event, which is tomorrow, you can collect here, and also the QR code for those of you interested in Passport for Success, you can scan from there and collect some brochures about our economics program.